Now, last time we did a lot of tidying up of our code in certain ways. The blueprints still look like a mess. I'll work on that later. And we now have a more or less functioning inventory here, which has a highlight selection, it has a delete button, it has a drop button. We can pick up some items, but as you could see, the thing that I just did there was opening a chest, quote unquote. And I don't know, that's not usually how chests work. They don't just explode items into the world. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. But as you can see, everything works as you expect an inventory to work. This is what we've been making so far. Today, let's actually make this chest into a chest rather than something that just bars items into the world, because that's not really what we want. To get started here, first things first, I'm going to put this inventory slot image into a different folder. And we're going to just copy over the player inventory, really, because what we're going to be doing is a slightly different version of the player inventory. So we'll call this WBP chests inventory. And when we open that up and put it into our tabs here, we'll see that we have the player inventory as we're used to. For this version of everything, I don't think we're going to necessarily need the delete or drop button. It could be useful to have that in a chest to be able to take things out of the chest and drop them into the world, but if you're going to do that, you might as well just keep them in the chest, right? And the same thing with deleting them. There's no real use to having these around, so let's just remove those. And that allows us to make the inventory for the player a little bit larger. Then we'll name this item grid player because we need to display two item grids here, two inventories that we're going to display. So let's duplicate this one over and we'll put that on the other side of the screen, roughly in the same position, and we'll anchor it to the right side of the screen. It's probably not going to look very good right now, but this is mostly about functionality and not visual design. And this one we'll call item grid chest. Now, going into the graph, we need to set up a couple of things, because usually we have the player inventory component and the and such all being set through spawning the thing in. And that's still going to be how we set the inventory component for the chest, obviously. But for the player inventory component, we don't have to worry too much about it, because that's always going to be the player. The way I showed you before is a more generic way to pass through information and references from parent to children or whatever, which we're still going to be using. But for the player itself, what we can actually do is we can set the player inventory component value through a very easy method, and that is just getting a set node, and we'll get the player character. And since we made a interface to get the inventory from any object, really, right at the start of this series, we can very easily just get the inventory from the player. If you want to make sure that it is a valid object, you can put a isValid node in here. I don't really care, so I'm not going to do that. And that way we can get the value for the player's inventory component into this very, very easily. Now, we could have also done it this way in the actual player inventory, and you probably should do it. But I just wanted to show you the way to pass through that information from layer to layer to layer. Because otherwise, I would have to explain it at this point. And there's plenty enough that we're going to have to cover in this video. Now, that said, we do need to also make a chest inventory component, which is of course going to be of type inventory component. This one we will set in much the same way. So we're going to expose on spawn and set this to instance editable. And then the player inventory component is actually not going to be exposed on spawn or instance editable for that matter. And here we have the item grid for the player being set by the player inventory component, which is exactly what we want. So we'll copy that over and get the chest inventory component. And there we will try to set as the value for the grid that the chest is going to use. So in here we can then also set inventory component, because that's a variable on the grid that we need to populate, and that'll do what it has to do. Whenever we construct this thing, of course, we are also going to immediately do a first update for the player grid, and you guessed it, we also need to do that for the chest grid. So we can just copy over this node, link this all up, and that will do just fine. Now, if we go back to our chest blueprint and open it up, we also have like our interaction interface on here, and we set that to just spawn in the items inside the chest. Of course, that's not what we're going to do anymore here. So we'll delete all of the code that we put in here in the first place. We also have a return node just hanging out somewhere. And in its events graph, we're going to go back here to begin play. Because on begin play, I actually want to create the widget right away. And of course, the widget that we're going to create is the chest inventory. Because I want to set the chest inventory component value right off the bat. And then we'll promote this to a variable and we'll call this chest UI. Because now we can go back to onInteracted and we can just get this chest UI and add it to the viewport here. So we can add to viewport, but the UI element will always exist on the chest. We'll only add it to the viewport when they become relevant. This is not, technically speaking, the most ideal version of it, because now every chest is always going to have its UI loaded into memory, ready to be displayed on the screen. These UI elements are so negligently small for your memory footprint that unless you have a ridiculous amount of chests, it's not going to matter, and it does make this just a little easier to deal with. Now, whenever we put it on the viewport, we also want to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information on the inventory. It should display the most up-to-date information on the inventory, but it can't hurt to make an event that specifically does that. So what we'll do is we'll make a custom event in the chest inventory blueprint, and we'll just call this updates item grids. And that will just go into the same thing as the event construct. We can just run this manually to make sure that everything has the most up-to-date values in them. And we can just run that from our chest UI reference. So we can just update item grids just to be sure. Now, then we want to set our input mode to UI only. For that, we need to get the player controller because, of course, set input mode to UI only. You can also set this to gameplay and UI. It really depends on your own game. And the widget that we want to be focusing on is our chest UI widget. And we also want to make sure that our set show mouse cursor is set to true, because we're going to be, well, mousing all around the screen trying to do some inventory management. So set that to true. And that should now allow us to open up this chest and see its inventory. And we can even, within the inventory itself, move things around. But what we cannot yet do is drag this from one inventory into another. There is a little bugginess if you try to split it into this inventory. That does work for some reason. I have not programmed anything in for this to work. It just straight up works. I'm going to be real with you. I'm kind of confused as to how this works. So let's get working on that. And for that, we're going to need to revise a fair few functions that we have made on our inventory components to take into account not only moving things around in one inventory, but also have a sense of a source and a target inventory. So let's open up our item slot just to see our graph here with all the functions that have to do with switching items around and moving items and whatever. Because all of those are going to now need to also have an input for a source and a target, or at least most of them. Let's start with the most important function, which is the swap slot. This is just the left click, dragging an item into a different slot. And if we open that up, we'll see that, again, this is a quite simple function. Let's go and add some parameters to this, shall we? We want to add a source inventory, which of course will be a inventory component. And then we'll also add a target inventory, so target inventory. Instead of just using the array from this side over here, just dragging that in, what we're going to do is we're going to take the source stack from our source inventory. So we want to get the inventory array on our source, and that's going to go into this getting node instead. And much of the same we're going to do down here. We're going to get our target inventory. We'll find the inventory array in that and use that instead in this getting node. So no more simply dragging and dropping this from the sidebar, because now we need to be aware of the original inventory and the inventory that we're putting things into. Same thing goes for here. This is just both using the normal inventory array that we have, but we want to put the target stack into the original source inventory and the source stack into the target inventory. So we'll take the source inventory, the array, and we're going to put that into the first node here, the thing that is setting where the target stack is going to go. And we'll take the target inventory array and put that in the other set array element. Now, it's also important that we do the call on inventory changed properly, because this is just going to call this on the inventory component that is being run on itself, but it should actually execute this on both of the inventories. So it should execute this on the source inventory, but also on the target inventory. And now that we have that set up, we can go back into our item slots and we'll see that our swap slots function now has 2 more pins in it. How are we going to get the information to put in those pins? Well, that's remarkably easy for both of them actually, because we already have a inventory component on our item slot, and that's just going to be our target, because this is the thing that we're dropping on top of. The source inventory component is actually also really easy, because if you remember back all the way to when we make this drag and drop operation, I added in a source inventory component as one of the values here, and up until now we haven't really used that, but I knew that we're going to get to this point and we were going to need to use it, so I included it right off the bat. Going back into our item slot on drag detected, you will remember that we put the inventory component into the drag drop operation that we created. So this is taking the inventory component from the item that we're taking and passing it through the drag and drop operation, so that when we eventually drop it back into another slot, we still have that reference to the slot that we've taken from. And that means that we on drop simply can go back to our drag drop operation and we can get the source inventory component. And it's just as easy as that, plugging that into our swap slot. So that's the basic setup that we're going to have to do for more or less all of these functions. But let's just show off the fact that it works first here in this. So I can now take this from this inventory and put it into this other inventory, and I can just swap these back and forth as much as I want to. So now let's take a look at some of the other ones. We also have the put a new stack, the add item to stack, and the merge stack functions. Now that we've gone over these are going to be somewhat more simple. The put in new stack will just take in any inventory array and put an item into an index in that array. That's quite fine. This doesn't even need a source and a target. This only really needs a target. And as such, we don't actually need to put any new pins into this one. So that's fantastic. Add item to stack. This one, however, is also used to add items into a stack potentially in the chest, because we're also using this in the right click drag and drop operation. So this one does actually need to have a source and a destination. So let's add in our source inventory specified, and for that we will get the inventory array, and we'll just replace this reference here with the reference from our target inventory, which then also needs to be updated with on inventory change. Going back into our item slots, we now have add item to stack here, which will be in our target inventory. So we can just get our inventory component from our variables and put that in there. That only leaves the merge stacks function, which, if you recall, is a mess. I probably should have cleaned this up before starting this video, eh? Well, it's a little too late for that now. So let's take a look at it. We need to have a concept here of source and target both. So we have the source inventory, because this blueprint wasn't confusing enough as is. Don't worry, as I've said before in other videos, by the time the project is finished and everything is up for Patreons and YouTube members, this will all be a lot neater and a lot more organized. The episode by episode uploads that I'm also doing for these project files, they're going to be messy. The final one is going to have more reroute nodes, going to save things as variables so that they're a little bit easier on the eyes. They're going to be commented and all that. Anyway, we have our source inventory and our target inventory now. So let's take a look at which ones belong where. This first one here is setting the targets. So let's get our target inventory, because this is the slot that is getting the new items. So get inventory array. So we can replace that with the target. And then this one is clearing out the original slot that things came from. So that's going to need to be taken from the source inventory slot. So get inventory array from the source and clear that out here. And in much the same way, we need to use the target inventory, which is this one, in this bottom set array element down here. And then we need to add items to stack. That's the function that we just changed as it was. That now has a target inventory. And the target inventory here is going to be the source inventory. And that might sound like a confusing sentence, but let's just think about what is happening here. We are setting some items to the new inventory slot, and everything that is left over is getting put back into the inventory slot that it originally came from, otherwise known as the source inventory. So we take the reference to our source inventory and put that into the add items to stack function here. And then down here we have something very similar going on. So we want to pull down this reference to our source inventory slot into the add items to stack as well. And then these are both going to be our target inventory slots. So that will be our target inventory, and we'll get the inventory array out of that one as well. So as you can see, a lot of what we're doing right now is just retrofitting existing code to work with multiple inventories and not so much doing new code. And with that, we can go back into our item slot and also put in the proper values for the merge stack. So the target inventory in both cases, merge stacks is in 2 locations. There's the second one, is going to be just the inventory component reference that we have in our variables. And the source is going to be the one we get from the drag and drop operation, the thing that we pass through when we start the drag and drop operation. So now that all of that is lined up, our dragging and dropping between inventories should just straight up work. So let's open up our chest and see, okay, we can drag and drop this over, and then we can drag and drop half of it back over to there, and that works. Drag and drop half over to there. And as you could see, actually, I didn't even mention this before, but because we set up that chest to have 2 stacks of 20 in it, you can very easily set up chests and generate chests that are more compact than you as the player can actually do, because it just generates those stacks of 20, and then when you pull those stacks of 20 apart, you can't recombine them anymore because of how we have things set up. So if you want to have like a uber chest where the player has to start choosing what they do and do not take, that might be an interesting way of doing things. Just adding like stacks of like 100 gold coins in every single one of these slots, and gold coins only stack up to like 50. So you can only take half of them at a time. Just very interesting opportunities for your game design. Anyway, we can just inventory manage between these 2 inventories. The last little issue here, though, is that we still can't exit out of this inventory because our player input is getting blocked because we're setting this to UI only mode. So let's get back real quick, and the easiest way to just fix that is just adding a simple button. We'll add a button, and we'll add that to the bottom middle anchor, and we'll just add in a little bit of text that just says close chest or something like that. Close chest, and probably make this black color so that it's more readable. And then when we click this, I'll just put that down here somewhere. We can do the onClicked event, and what this will simply do is it will get the player controller. It will first and foremost set the mouse cursor shown to false, and it will set the input mode back to game only. So input mode game only. We can flush that input so that the game itself doesn't pick up on that click in case we have like a attack set to our left click action or whatever. And after that, we simply remove this widget from parent. So that's going to remove it from the viewport. And with that, we have a nice chest that we can very easily close again, and we have control of our character. And you can just add your own items to these chests as well. I mean, that should be obvious, but I just want to show you. And if I take some items out of it, I close the chest. It's just an inventory component that is going to survive as long as this object is alive. So if I open up the chest again, the contents still are the contents that we left in them. Now, if you're streaming this chest in and out, of course, you're going to need to put that into a save data object, but that's not really what this tutorial series is about. And I'm going to assume that you know how to either save data or carry over data into like the game instance or whatever. But this is how you make a chest functional for your game. So with that, we only really have one more important thing that I really want to do, and that is making a shop for you. Because a shop is kind of like a chest, but slightly different. And for the full course, if you're watching this in the future, it should be all up on the YouTube channel already. But if you're watching this shortly after it was uploaded, there will be a link down below in the description to the Patreon where you can find the full course, plus a little bonus episode where we go over and change some things to make some alternative ways to interact with the inventory, which will be a Patreon exclusive episode. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. And a special thanks to my Cave Digger tier Patreons, Sir J. Thomas,